Welcome back to my channel. For today's monster, we are going to be talking about ghosts. So if you're new here, welcome. Feel free to like and subscribe if you like it, and hit the notification bell so you can be notified whenever I put out new videos. And I think it's interesting because ghosts often don't represent monsters in like the normal sense of the word. Is there a normal sense? But they represent our relationship with the dead. So for instance, a lot of anthropologists consider the appearance of funerary rites or the idea of burial customs, like creating a special area or rituals, as a sign of civilized culture. That engagement with the dead among the living can even extend beyond the funeral or the funeral rites, for example. Take the Roman families, for example. They have wax images of their family members' faces kept in a special part of the house, which would be a good story. And in Japanese Buddhism, there is a time of the year called Obon season, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, where the dead come to visit the family, and the family in turn practices ancestor worship. China has Ghost Month and ghost days that are celebrated with a similar thing where the deceased come back to visit the living. And then of course you have Dia de los Muertos, where the ancestors are honored with gifts and their favorite foods or beverages. And ghosts often represent the idea of the individual, especially the soul. The soul. The idea of the soul does have some origins in certain religions where there is like an intangible substance that connects you to whatever divine being. But that is also a relationship of the body to the I, right? That starts to happen as a person ages. There's this consistency of the I, of the self, that occurs throughout all of the different ages. So it kind of makes a question of like, am I just my body, or do I exist beyond my body? And that question persists, and the I persists throughout all of the changes. And there's a question of like, does that continue on past death? So in funerary practices, a majority of cultures, there are also beliefs that something is released from the body after death. And in Christian terminology, it's often called the anima or the soul. And the Egyptians call it the Ba. The Hebrews call it Eidolon. And regardless of what it's called, it's considered a part of the self that continues beyond the body, as an immortal aspect of the self. Now, with the presence of a ghost, there is often also an acknowledgement of another world, right? The spirit world, which is an invisible world where spirits reside, and it is often hidden to the senses because it's not a phenomenal world. It's a noumenal world, meaning it exists independently of like human senses or perception. However, ghosts in horror are often split into two camps. Well, there's a ton of ghost horror, but we're going to talk about just two. So in the first, they have an agenda, and they often appear to seek revenge, finish unfinished business. Maybe they want to settle a score for their own purposes or to address wrongdoing. And the second is what academics call spectral incognizance, which is when the ghosts aren't aware that they are ghosts and they believe that they're still living. So that first is a representation of the need to heal trauma. And the second is a representation of people, of humans' existential crisis and this desire to continue beyond the body in some way. And in horror, it's often never just a random ghost story, is it? It's never just someone who had a fantastic life, they had a good relationship, they had a good family, they had friends, there was no drama. But whenever there's a haunting, there's this monstrosity, and it's often not the ghost. It's the trauma of the history of the site. So the house is a place that becomes monstrous. And it's because of the act which causes the ghost to return. And that's why the ghost is always kind of more uncanny horror than slasher horror, because there isn't a spectacle of violence as much like when you have an axe murderer or a serial killer. The ghost never really makes you wince at the blood. Instead, it's often kind of seen as a tragic figure that introduces sympathy after recognizing the cause of that end, of that untimely death. So the ghost itself isn't just a representation of the individual, but really a symbol for a trauma that has not been healed. So the Greek word for ghost is something that I can't pronounce, but essentially it translates to phantasma. And it has an etymology in two different words. And the first is translated into to show, like to place in front of, or to bring it here. And the second is light. So the word kind of becomes showing through light or bringing to light, which is precisely what the specter in horror films does. And even though these tend to be more of a slow burn kind of horror, the ghosts bring to light past crimes, right? They bring out the secrets of the living and often unfinished business. Now, the majority of ghost films can be read as a psychological process of healing trauma, of digging up repressed memories, like hi ghost, and then really helping those traumas to find peace. And of course, in horror, there's often a lot of trauma done to the living people by ghosts. So it creates a circle of trauma, a cycle of trauma, which makes sense because we know trauma rarely affects solely the individual who experienced it. It kind of lives on in the individual in terms of like PTSD or intrusive thoughts, or like hypervigilance, meaning they're like constantly anxious and unable to relax, unable to sleep. Another kind of sounds like a ghost, right? So there are a lot of connections here. And there have also been dozens of studies about how adults who were physically or emotionally abused as children are more likely to repeat those patterns. So that's why they're always talking about breaking the cycle. And that's precisely what the ghost horror film is about, really breaking the cycle of abuse, bringing trauma to light, and moving on. Whether that's moving on to the next plane or simply moving into a new home where they can heal. And we'll get more into that in the individual videos like The Haunting of Hill House and stuff like that. But the ghost films really show families and individuals under duress. So their suffering really occurs because it's not because something is supernatural, but really because there's a very real violation or problem that occurred here in the real world, or the fiction world, of the world of the story. And I love the way that one of the literary theorists, Nicholas Abraham, puts it. He says that the phantom is a metapsychological fact. What haunts are not the dead, but the gaps left within us by the secrets of others. Woo. Yeah, that's good. So it's not really the individual of the ghost that we're concerned about, or at least like not usually. It's also a secret that was repressed long ago, like an infected wound. It oozes over into daily life. So it becomes more of a symbol that there is something out of place. There's something deeply wrong, and what's wrong has evolved over time, right? And it varies from film to film and from ghost to ghost. Like Shakespeare's ghost in Macbeth signifies a consciousness that's starting to return to the main character. He kind of has this realization of his own wrongdoing, and his persistence in denying the ghost creates a lot of other supernatural disturbances until the horror that he unleashes is very real, including the loss of his wife, and of course, since it's a Shakespearean tragedy, pretty much everyone dies, right? And then again in Hamlet, you have the presence of the father's ghost, which is a signification that there has been a wrongdoing. And that's kind of how he discovers that his uncle essentially usurped the throne from his father and from him by murdering him. And again, since it's a tragedy, the only way to wipe out all of the trauma for Shakespeare is to clean out the whole house, meaning pretty much everyone dies. And there's a huge variety of movements, even within horror movies since like the 30s and 40s, regarding ghosts. So they kind of started out with romances, and I'm pulling these from academic sources. I haven't watched the ghost movies from the 40s, but there was a movement towards the haunted house style ghost throughout the 70s and 80s, and then you kind of have the recession era of supernatural horror films, which kind of revolved around the financial anxieties of the middle class. And you have the female ghosts in the American remakes of Japanese horror films like The Ring, and like found footage stuff like the Blair Witch Project, which is more witch than ghost. I don't know. What's your opinion? And we'll get more into that in individual videos like The Haunting of Hill House and stuff like that. So these ghost stories are also often concerned with morality, and not just of the ghosts, but also of the victims or the people within the house. These films or TV shows kind of often start with real life dangers or pain, like suffering from horrible accidents, dealing with the death of a loved one, or a child or a spouse. Sometimes it's about divorce, dealing with adultery, or even losing a job. And location is very important in ghost stories. And another kind of fun like etymology thing, if you like that, for all my word people out there. The etymology for the German word of uncanny, which is unheimlich, I think. Is that how you say it? I don't know. The root is heim, which means ding, 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 home. So the uncanny is something that truly disturbs us in a place where we often feel most safe, where we feel most comfortable. The familiar place like the home becomes unfamiliar because of these old wounds the home and the people inside the home often have. And again, it's never just like a random place. It's a place of haunting, a place of dwelling. It's often domestic. You don't see like a ton of ghost stories about corporations unless you're like supernatural, and I feel like those were leviathans, right? Not ghosts. I don't know. There are so many episodes they've probably done a ghost in a workplace, right? But the dwelling place, the home, is meant to be a place to take refuge, right? It's a poetic space, but when there's trauma, it becomes a place to be afraid. And it becomes a site of terror where the person becomes haunted. Okay, so let's get into the ghosts who think that they're still alive. These are the narratives of ghosts who aren't necessarily aware of their own death, and it's kind of a whole subgenre of the ghost film, right? There are movies like The Sixth Sense, The Others, stuff like that. And generally, the protagonist is framed for the viewer to really identify with them. And then in the final moments of the film, or in the climax, they realize that they are in fact dead. And in some way, they are kind of prolonging the dying process. So generally, they are stuck in cycles of repetition. They're kind of wandering in these metaphorical circles of their past lives. They're repeating movements, moments, and their fears. And this is often a way for the characters to sustain a fantasy that they're still alive. And that kind of allows them to bury a trauma of their death, which the story is again about kind of healing this form of trauma, really forcing these ghosts to come to terms with whatever happened. And of course, generally speaking, it's always like a violent death, right? Being taken too soon. And although I feel like I would actually really love to see like a horror story where it's someone who was just really old, really aged, who just kind of died from their body failing. And yeah, I feel like I actually love that. Don't steal that, okay? Like the biggest difference between the two kinds of ghosts in the relationship for the audience. So the first is kind of where they're trying to accomplish their own goals. The viewer has more identification with the main character, who is not a ghost, at least in some of these films. But in the ones where the ghost isn't aware, they're often the main character, so the reader or the viewer has more identification with them. And this does something very particular where when the main character realizes that they're dead, the reader or the viewer kind of is thrown into shock, right? They're supposed to be really reflective in those moments. It's supposed to be like one of those moments where you're thinking to yourself like, whoa, like where in my life have I been dead? Where have I not been truly living? And of course, they often also have kind of a moralizing tale. These the ghost tales often claim that the horror of the wound, whether that's of the individual who believes that they're alive when they're actually dead, or whether it's kind of the ghost as a symbol of trauma, the wound can be overcome through things like self-sacrifice or bravery, stuff like that. So in conclusion, the success of the ghost story isn't whether the ghost has been laid to rest, right? Like instead, it's because we've all seen those ghost stories where they continue on, like The Ring, where the only way to stay alive, and spoiler alert, can you do spoiler alerts for movies that are like 20 years old? I don't know. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen The Ring. But the only way to make a copy of, or the only way to survive is to make a copy of the tape, or essentially make a copy of the ghost. So you're making a copy of the trauma of the wound, and you really have to, like interpret each ghost story on its own individually to see what it truly means. And so if you are writing your own ghost story this October, that is definitely something to keep in mind. Has the wound been healed, or is it something that continues on? So again, that is all I got for you today for the ghosts. Please like and subscribe if you like this content. I've got some fun content coming out this month for Halloween with classic monsters, horror writing tips, and the analysis of some great horror and monster movies / TV shows. So I will see you soon. Thanks.